She was trying to buy a specialty D-ring keeper pin with her final $5, her card declining at the surplus yard register because her paycheck was delayed. But the formwork carpenter standing in line behind her didn't offer a pitying look or a dramatic financial rescue. He simply reached into his personal rigging pouch and handed her an exact spare pin for free. And what started as a practical exchange of spare parts turned into a story about two people who realized that real trust isn't built on steady ground, but on the quiet choices we make when we're holding each other's lives in our hands. Fiona Reeves was standing at the checkout counter of Industrial Supply Depot at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning in late September, and she was watching the cashier swipe her debit card for the third time while the line behind her grew longer and the cold fluorescent lights made everything feel more humiliating than it already was. 29 years old tower crane operator for Cascade Construction, working on the new Seattle Municipal Library project, and she'd been operating cranes for 6 years, sitting in a tiny steel cab 300 feet above street level for 10-hour shifts, and the pay was solid at $62 an hour, but her bank had put a 3-day hold on her paycheck deposit because of a fraud flag on her account, which meant her checking account was currently sitting at $4.73 until the hold cleared tomorrow. The item she was trying to purchase was a $5 stainless steel D-ring keeper pin, the kind that went through her personal climbing harness D-ring and prevented the carabiner from cross-loading during vertical ascents. And hers had bent yesterday when she'd caught it on a ladder rung climbing down from her crane cab at shift end. The cashier, a guy in his 50s with grease under his fingernails and zero patience, swiped the card again, and the register made that declining beep that echoed through the whole surplus yard. And Fiona felt heat crawl up her neck because she could hear people shifting behind her, checking their watches, sighing. "Card's not going through. You got another form of payment, or should I void this?" the cashier asked, and his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about what kind of person showed up to buy safety equipment they couldn't afford. Fiona pulled out her wallet and checked the cash compartment, even though she knew what was there. A crumpled $5 bill that was technically enough, except Washington State sales tax would push the total to $5.44. "I've got $5 cash. Can you take that and I'll cover the rest when I get paid Friday?" she asked, knowing how it sounded, and the cashier was already shaking his head. "System won't let me split payments on anything under $10. Register limitation. Either you got the full amount or you don't," he said, and he was reaching to void the transaction when a voice from behind Fiona cut in. "Clerk, keep the pin on the rack." Fiona turned and saw a guy about her age, maybe early 30s, wearing heavy canvas work pants and a Carhartt jacket that had dried concrete dust in the creases. And he had a leather rigging pouch on his belt that looked like it weighed about 10 pounds from all the tools and hardware inside. He was already reaching into the pouch and pulling something out. And when he stepped forward, Fiona saw it was an identical stainless steel D-ring keeper pin still in its plastic packaging. He set the pin on the counter next to Fiona's attempted purchase and looked at the cashier. "She doesn't need to buy this one. I've got extras." Then he turned to Fiona, and his eyes went to her climbing harness, which was looped over her shoulder, standard practice for crane operators who kept their personal safety gear with them instead of trusting the company locker rooms. "Our safety supplier had a bulk discount last week, and I grabbed a 5-pin set for the crew. I've got 2 spares in my pouch that are just taking up weight. Take this one. I'll see you on the deck." He said it matter of fact, no performance, just solving a problem, and then he stepped back in line and pulled out his own wallet to pay for the bundle of zip ties he was purchasing. Fiona stood there, holding the pin he'd given her, and the plastic packaging was still crisp, which meant it was brand new. And she looked at him and managed to say, "Thank you, I can pay you back Friday when my deposit hits." But he waved her off. "Don't worry about it. Safety gear is not something you skimp on. Just pass it forward when you can." The cashier voided her transaction, and Fiona moved aside. And as she walked out to her truck, she looked at the pin in her hand and realized she'd just been saved from either working without proper safety equipment or being late to her shift. And the guy hadn't made her feel small about needing the help. He'd just fixed it. She made it to the library construction site by 7:15 and took the personnel lift up to her crane cab. This cramped steel box at the top of the tower that was 12 feet long and maybe 4 feet wide, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a control panel that looked like the cockpit of a small aircraft. The climb up was always Fiona's favorite part of the day because it meant leaving the chaos of the ground behind. All the shouting and diesel engines and compressed air tools and dozens of workers moving around and entering this quiet, isolated space where it was just her and the machinery and the vast open sky. The sensory processing issues she'd dealt with since childhood made ground-level construction sites almost unbearable. Too much noise and movement and unpredictable stimuli coming from every direction. But up here in the crane cab, she could focus completely, communicate through the simple clarity of her two-way radio, and do work that required precision and calm. She settled into her operator's seat and started her pre-shift systems check, testing the hoist motors and slew drives and load moment indicators. And through her windows, she could see the entire Seattle skyline spreading out in the early morning light. Around 11:30, her radio crackled on channel 14, which was the frequency the formwork carpenters used for coordinating deck work, and a voice came through that she recognized immediately from the surplus yard. "Tower crane operator, this is deck-level formwork lead. You got a minute to help me spot a panel placement?" Fiona keyed her mic and responded using the site protocol. "Formwork lead, this is crane 22. Go ahead with your coordinates." The voice came back, and it was definitely the guy from this morning. "Crane 22, we need eyes on the northwest corner, panel 8 Charlie, trying to verify alignment before we lock the ties." Fiona swiveled her operator's chair and looked down at the coordinates he'd given, and from 300 feet up, she had a perfect view of the wooden formwork panel in question, could see it was about 2 inches off alignment from where it needed to be. "Formwork lead, crane 22, your panel 8, Charlie is offset northeast about 2 inches. Recommend shifting before locking." There was a pause, and then his voice came back. "Crane 22, you just saved us from having to redo this whole section. Appreciate the eyes. Formwork lead out." The radio went quiet, and Fiona went back to her scheduled lifts, moving steel rebar bundles and concrete buckets and plywood sheets, according to the choreographed dance that was high-rise construction. And at 12:30, her supervisor called over the radio to say she could take her lunch break. She pulled out the insulated lunch bag she'd packed that morning, peanut butter sandwich and an apple and a thermos of coffee, and she was eating while looking out at the Cascade Mountains in the distance when her radio crackled again on channel 14. "Crane 22, formwork lead, you on lunch?" the voice asked, and Fiona swallowed her bite of sandwich and keyed her mic. "Affirmative, 30-minute break. What do you need?" There was a pause, and then the voice came back different, less formal. "Nothing work-related. Just figured if we're both eating, we might as well keep each other company over the radio. I'm Gabe, by the way, the guy from the surplus yard. You're the crane operator who needed the keeper pin." Fiona felt something unexpected, this small warmth that came from being recognized not as Crane 22, but as the person he'd helped that morning. "I'm Fiona. And yeah, that was me. Thanks again for the pin. Saved me from either being unsafe or being late," she said, and she heard Gabe's voice come back with what sounded like a smile in it. "No problem. I saw your harness and figured you were tower crew. Those pins are too important to skip. What are you working on up there?" Fiona realized they were still on the work channel. "Formwork lead, hang on, switching to channel 9, she said, dialing to the unofficial break channel. "Copy, switching to 9, Gabe responded, and they continued their conversation on the clear channel. They fell into conversation, and Fiona found herself describing what she could see from her cab, the way the clouds were building over the mountains, suggesting rain later. The cargo ships moving through Puget Sound like slow-moving toys from her vantage point, the strange peace of being up in the sky while the city moved below. Gabe described his work in turn, the smell of fresh-cut cedar formwork, and how the wood grain determined which direction you could safely apply pressure. The satisfaction of setting a panel perfectly level, knowing it would hold thousands of pounds of wet concrete, the geometry of building the skeleton that would eventually become walls and floors. They talked through both their lunch breaks, 30 minutes that felt like 10, and when Fiona's supervisor called her back to work, she found herself disappointed the conversation was ending. Over the next 2 weeks, eating lunch over Channel 9 became routine, and Fiona learned that Gabe had been doing formwork carpentry for 8 years, that he'd grown up in Tacoma and learned the trade from his uncle, that he preferred working the early crew hours from 7 to 3 because it meant he had afternoons to work in his home woodshop building furniture. Gabe learned that Fiona had gotten her crane operator certification at 23 through a union apprenticeship program, that she'd worked on everything from bridge construction to high-rises, that the isolation of the crane cab wasn't loneliness for her, it was necessary quiet that let her brain process the world without getting overwhelmed. One day in early October, a cold rain started halfway through the afternoon shift, and Gabe's crew was working late trying to secure a concrete pour before the weather got worse. And Fiona could see from her cab that they were losing daylight fast, and the work lights on the deck level weren't adequate. She keyed her radio on channel 14. Formwork lead, crane 2-2, I'm going to hit my auxiliary floods, give you better visibility on that pour. She flipped the switches that controlled the massive LED floodlights mounted on her crane's tower mast, and 3 million lumens of light flooded the northwest corner of the deck where Gabe and his crew were working. The radio crackled and Gabe's voice came through. Crane 2-2, that's perfect. You just gave us another 40 minutes of work time. We're going to make this deadline because of you. Fiona watched from above as the crew finished their work in the bright pools of light, and when they finally cleared the deck, Gabe's voice came back private on channel 14. Fiona, seriously, thank you. That was exactly what we needed. How do I pay that back? Fiona smiled in her cab 300 feet up. You already did. With a $5 safety pin, we're even. What started as radio conversations during lunch breaks turned into something neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. And by mid-October, Fiona and Gabe had developed this routine where they'd check in throughout the day on channel 14. Quick exchanges about weather conditions or deck progress or just confirmation that they were both still there doing the work. Fiona would key her mic and say, Formwork lead, looks like rain coming in from the west. You might want to cover that fresh pour. And Gabe would respond, Crane 2-2, already on it, appreciate the heads up. And these small practical exchanges felt more intimate than any dinner date Fiona had been on because they were built on actual trust and attention. The relationship grew in these incremental ways that felt substantial because they were rooted in the reality of their work. And one Saturday morning in late October, Gabe showed up at the site during his day off and left something at the crane operator's check-in station with Fiona's name on it. When she arrived for her Monday shift, the site supervisor handed her a canvas tool bag, and inside were ergonomic foam grip wraps designed specifically for crane controls, still in the manufacturer packaging with the safety certification sticker visible. There was a note in Gabe's handwriting that said, Noticed you rubbing your wrist during our last radio check. These should help with the cramping. Their size for the Liebherr 55 OHC control layout. And Fiona felt something shift in how she understood what care looked like. She installed them that morning, wrapping the foam grips over the standard plastic controls, and the difference was immediate. Her wrists stayed neutral through the whole shift instead of aching by hour 6. And when she radioed him at lunch to say thank you, his response was simple. Saw them at the supply house. You kept me safe with your floodlights. Seemed like a fair trade. They started coordinating their breaks, not just lunch, but the morning 15-minute pause around 9:30, and they'd talk about everything from crane maintenance to formwork techniques to their completely opposite experiences of the same job site. Fiona's quiet, isolated sky perspective versus Gabe's chaotic, crowded ground-level reality. She told him about growing up with sensory processing differences that made normal social situations exhausting, how she'd tried office work and retail and food service, and hated all of it because the unpredictable noise and interruptions made her brain feel like it was short-circuiting, and how crane operation had been the first job where her need for quiet focus was an asset instead of a liability. Gabe told her about learning carpentry from his uncle, who'd been a Finnish carpenter before arthritis forced him to retire, about the satisfaction of building temporary structures that were crucial but invisible once the concrete was poured, about how most people never thought about the wooden frameworks that held the city together while it was being built. Formwork is like scaffolding for concrete. You build these precise wooden molds, pour liquid stone into them, wait for chemistry to turn it solid, then strip away the wood and move to the next section. Most people only see the finished concrete, never know that wood held that shape. November came in with freezing rain and wind that made crane operation genuinely dangerous, and there were 3 days that month where Fiona's crane got red tagged for weather. Winds over 35 miles per hour meant automatic shutdown because the risk of load swing was too high. She'd sit in her cab doing paperwork while the crane was locked in position, and she'd watch Gabe's crew working below. And one afternoon, when the wind was gusting hard enough to make her whole tower sway, she keyed her radio. Formwork lead, crane 2-2, you might want to secure any loose materials down there. Winds hitting 40 knots up here. It's going to be worse at deck level. Gabe's voice came back tense. Crane 2-2, we're already losing plywood sheets, trying to get everything tied down. Appreciate the warning. Fiona watched from above as the crew scrambled to secure their materials, and she could see how the wind was catching the large formwork panels and trying to lift them despite their weight. And she understood in that moment just how much their two jobs were interconnected. Her safely managing the vertical lifts and him safely managing the horizontal assembly, both of them holding pieces of the same massive puzzle. The microburst hit on the afternoon of November 14th with zero warning, one of those autumn weather events where atmospheric conditions create a violent downdraft that spreads out horizontally when it hits the ground. And Fiona's anemometer readings went from 15 knots to 60 knots in less than 30 seconds. She'd been in the middle of a lift, a massive concrete formwork panel weighing 5,000 pounds suspended on her main cable about 80 feet above the deck, and the sudden wind caught the panel like a sail and spun it violently out of control, the cable whipping in directions it was never designed to move. Her radio exploded with voices, the site supervisor calling for emergency shutdown. Gabe's voice shouting, "Crew scramble! Everyone to the core stairwell now!" And Fiona could see from her cab that Gabe and 4 other workers were trapped on the northwest corner of the deck directly under where her spinning concrete panel was swinging in wider and wider arcs. The safety protocols said secure the load and evacuate the cab, but securing meant trying to control a 5,000-pound pendulum in 60-knot winds, and Fiona could see that wasn't going to work. The panel was going to swing wide enough to crush everyone on that corner of the deck. She had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision, and her hand moved to the emergency stop and load lower control, the fail-safe system that immediately locked the slew and initiated controlled emergency descent at the maximum safe speed. The reinforced laydown area was a steel deck zone on the south side of the deck, empty and reinforced specifically for emergency dumps. And Fiona calculated the trajectory while her brain screamed that this was insane, yanked the lever, and felt her entire crane shudder as 5,000 pounds of concrete panel went into freefall. The cable whipped with so much violent energy that it snapped the jib back toward the tower, and the deceleration when the backup brake engaged was so sudden and powerful that Fiona got thrown forward against her control console despite her safety harness, and she felt something in her ribcage crack on impact, this bright, sharp pain that made her vision go white for a second. Through the windows, she saw the concrete panel crash into the reinforced laydown area exactly where it needed to go. Metal decking, shrieking but holding, and the deck where Gabe's crew had been standing was clear. Everyone had made it to the stairwell. Nobody was hurt. Her radio crackled with confirmations. All personnel accounted for, no injuries, crane operator that was incredible reaction time. But Fiona couldn't respond because she couldn't breathe right. Her ribs were screaming, and her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't key the mic. The site supervisor ordered full evacuation, and Fiona made it down from her cab on pure adrenaline. And when she got to ground level, the EMTs checked her over and confirmed severely bruised ribs, maybe a small fracture, mandatory time off pending medical clearance, and the whole time Gabe was standing there looking at her with this expression she couldn't read. The month off gave Fiona way too much time to think, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw that concrete panel spinning over Gabe's head, saw how close she'd come to dropping 5,000 pounds on the person she cared about most, and her hands would start shaking again. She'd been operating cranes for 6 years without a serious incident, And now this. Now the knowledge that she held people's lives in her hands every single day, and one miscalculation could end everything. The panic attack started on day 3 of her leave, waking up at 2 a.m. with her heart racing and her hands trembling, and this certainty that she couldn't go back up in that cab. She tried going back to work when her medical clearance and incident investigation finally came through 4 weeks later. Made it to the site and took the lift up to her crane and got about halfway before her hands started shaking so badly she had to come back down. And the site supervisor was understanding but firm. "You're not cleared to operate if you're having physical symptoms. Take another week. See the company therapist. We need you, but we need you safe." Fiona drove home and sat in her truck in the parking lot and made a decision that felt like survival, even though she knew it was really just fear. She submitted her resignation that afternoon, 2 weeks' notice that she'd spend doing ground-level equipment inventory instead of crane operation, and she applied for jobs that didn't involve heights or heavy machinery or holding anyone's life in her hands. The warehouse position came through on her last day at the library site. Parts inventory specialist for an industrial supply company, 3 counties north. Quiet work in a climate-controlled building, organizing bolts and fittings and safety equipment, and the pay was $15 less per hour, but that seemed like a fair trade for not having panic attacks. She didn't tell Gabe any of this in person, couldn't make herself face him because she knew he'd try to talk her out of it, and she couldn't afford to be convinced. So she waited until she'd moved her stuff into a studio apartment in Everett and started the warehouse job before she sent the text. "Gabe, I can't do this. My hands are still shaking, and I almost killed you. Every time I think about getting back in that crane cab, I can't breathe. I can't carry the weight of your safety anymore. I need to be alone. Please don't look for me." She hit send at 11:30 at night and turned her phone off and sat in her empty apartment with her bruised ribs still aching and tried to convince herself this was the right choice. Gabe read the text message at 4:45 the next morning, sitting in his truck in the library site parking lot. And he'd been trying to reach Fiona for 2 weeks since she disappeared from the job without explanation. And now this message explained everything and nothing at the same time. He sat there looking at the words on his screen and then looked up at the empty sky where her crane tower stood unused, waiting for a replacement operator that the company was still trying to hire. And he understood what she was doing, recognized the fear-driven retreat because he'd seen it before in workers who'd had close calls. He didn't call her 15 times or send desperate messages begging her to reconsider. He just sat there and thought about what she'd actually said. "I can't carry the weight of your safety anymore." And he realized she'd been carrying that weight alone this whole time, thinking crane operation meant being solely responsible for everyone below. And that was the thing that needed to change. He put his phone in his pocket and grabbed his coffee and headed to the site. And his brain was already working on the problem, because Gabe solved problems with his hands. And if Fiona needed something built or carved or made that would show her she wasn't alone in carrying the weight, then that's what he'd build. Saturday afternoon in mid-January came in with freezing rain that made the road slick and turned the whole Pacific Northwest into this gray watercolor painting. And Fiona was working her shift at Cascade Industrial Supply Warehouse in Everett, organizing metric fasteners in aisle 12 when she heard the loading dock door roll open, which was weird because they didn't get deliveries on weekends. She was 3 counties away from Seattle and 3 weeks into a job that paid $43,000 a year instead of the $130,000 she'd been making as a crane operator. And she'd convinced herself that the trade-off was worth it because her hands had stopped shaking, and she could sleep through the night without seeing concrete panels spinning over people's heads. The warehouse was this massive climate-controlled building that smelled like cardboard and machine oil, rows and rows of industrial shelving holding every kind of bolt and bracket and safety equipment you could imagine. And Fiona's job was to scan inventory and organize stock and occasionally help contractors find whatever specialized hardware they needed. It was quiet work that didn't require her to hold anyone's life in her hands, didn't involve heights or heavy machinery or split-second decisions that could end in catastrophe. And she'd been telling herself since she started that this was enough, that safety and stability were worth more than the work she'd loved. She heard footsteps coming through the warehouse, heavy work boots on concrete, and she looked up from her clipboard to see Gabe walking down aisle 12, wearing his canvas work jacket and jeans that had sawdust on them, despite the rain outside. He was carrying something large wrapped in a moving blanket, and Fiona's first instinct was to hide, to duck between the shelving units and pretend she hadn't seen him, but her body wouldn't cooperate, just stood there frozen while he walked closer. He didn't look angry or hurt, just determined in that way he got when he was solving a problem. And when he reached her, he set down whatever he was carrying on the metal packing table with this solid thunk that suggested real weight. "Gabe, what are you doing here? I told you I needed space. I can't." "I'm not going back to that job," Fiona said, and her voice came out defensive because she'd spent 2 months building walls around the decisions she'd made, and she couldn't afford to let anyone knock them down. Gabe pulled back the moving blanket and revealed what he'd brought, and Fiona felt something in her chest crack open because sitting on the packing table was a 3-foot-tall scale model of her exact crane, a luffing jib tower crane carved entirely from cedar wood with a level of detail that must have taken hundreds of hours. Every structural member was there, the tower mast and the slewing ring and the jib sections, all carved to precise scale, and the cable systems were represented with actual braided steel wire running through tiny pulleys that actually worked, and the operator's cab was this perfect miniature with windows you could see through and a door that opened on actual hinges. The whole thing smelled like fresh cedar, and the wood had been sanded so smooth it felt like silk under Fiona's fingers, and she could see where Gabe had used different carving techniques to show the texture of steel versus the smooth surface of the cab's windows. And the base had a small brass plate engraved with Liebherr 550HC, built to hold the weight. "You carved this? You made this entire thing by hand," Fiona said, and she was running her fingers over the jib sections that had these tiny bolt heads carved into them. Details so small you'd miss them unless you were looking close. Gabe stood on the other side of the packing table with his hands in his pockets, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and factual. "I've been working on it every night since you left. Probably put in about 200 hours total. Used the engineering drawings from the Liebherr technical manual to get the proportions right. Each section is doweled and glued. The whole thing's solid. You could probably drop it and it wouldn't break." Fiona felt tears starting, and she hated it. Hated that he'd driven 3 counties in freezing rain to show her something beautiful when she was trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. "I told you I can't go back. My hands still shake when I think about that microburst. I almost killed you and your whole crew because I was operating a machine I couldn't control. I can't carry that responsibility anymore." She was gripping the edge of the packing table hard enough that her knuckles went white, and Gabe walked around the table and stood next to her, looking at the cedar crane he'd built. "I didn't drive 3 counties to ask you to climb back up 300 feet, Fiona. I drove here because you spent 5 years lifting the heaviest things in this city, and you forgot that it's okay to let someone else carry the weight for a change," Gabe said, and he picked up the model crane and turned it so she could see the operator's cab. And through the tiny windows he'd carved 2 small wooden figures, one sitting at the controls and one standing behind with their hand on the operator's shoulder. "You saved my life during that microburst. You made a split-second decision that put yourself at risk to protect everyone on that deck. And instead of anyone telling you that was incredible, you've been sitting alone in a warehouse thinking you failed." He set the model back down, and his voice got quieter but more intense. "Your hands kept me safe during a wind shear that could have killed 6 people. I trust those hands more than any steel cable in this state, and the fact that you're scared just means you understand how serious the work is. That's not weakness, that's respect for the weight you carry." Fiona was crying for real now, and she couldn't make herself stop, and Gabe kept talking. "You don't have to face the wind alone anymore. You don't have to carry the responsibility by yourself. Let me hold the base. Let me be the counterweight. Whatever metaphor makes sense, I'm here. I'm not leaving." Fiona looked at this man who'd spent 200 hours carving a perfect replica of her crane to show her she wasn't alone, and she felt every defensive wall she'd built over the last 2 months just completely dissolve because he wasn't asking her to be fearless. He was just asking her to let him carry some of the fear with her. She let herself lean into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there in the empty warehouse next to a cedar crane model while freezing rain hammered the metal roof, and Fiona said into his shoulder, "I'm still scared. I don't know if I can go back up there. Then don't, not yet, not until you're ready. I'm not here to push you into anything, Gabe said, and he was rubbing circles on her back with his calloused carpenter hands. I'm here because I love you, and I need you to know that the microburst wasn't your fault. Wind shear is an act of physics, not an operator error, and the fact that you reacted fast enough to save everyone is proof you're exactly as good at this work as you always were. Fear doesn't erase skill. They stood there for a long time just breathing together, and finally Fiona pulled back enough to look at him. I love you too. I've been miserable here pretending I'm fine. I hate this job. I miss the sky. I miss talking to you on Channel 9. I miss doing work that actually uses my brain, Fiona said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that was terrifying but also relieving. I don't know how to get past the fear, but I want to try. I want to stop hiding. Gabe smiled for the first time since he'd walked into the warehouse. Then let's figure it out together. No timeline, no pressure, just you and me, and however long it takes, I'm not going anywhere. 9 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, the Seattle Municipal Library project was complete. 500,000 square feet of concrete in steel and glass that had taken 18 months to build, and the building's new 5th-floor public terrace overlooking the city was where Fiona and Gabe decided to get married. The ceremony was small, maybe 40 people total, mostly their union crew members and a few close friends, and the library director who'd agreed to let them rent the terrace after hours. And the roof deck had been decorated with simple copper pipe arches and potted ferns from the library's courtyard. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just clean and industrial and honest. Fiona wore a simple dress she'd found at a consignment shop, and Gabe wore his best flannel shirt and clean work pants. And the officiant was the site supervisor who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this, and their vows were short and practical, promises about showing up and sharing the weight and not walking out when things got hard. Gabe's vows included, I promise to always keep spare safety pins in my rigging pouch. And Fiona's included, I promise to use the auxiliary floods when you're working late. And everyone laughed because those promises meant something specific to the two of them that outsiders wouldn't understand. When they walked back down the concrete aisle as husband and wife, the entire construction crew stood in 2 lines wearing their best clean work clothes. And as Fiona and Gabe passed between them, every single worker raised their framing hammers in this gentle rhythmic salute that sounded like the machinery they'd spent 18 months operating. The reception was simple, folding tables with coffee and cider in mismatched ceramic mugs and sheet cake from the bakery that did all the crew's morning orders. And someone had rigged up a Bluetooth speaker playing classic rock, and it was perfect. 8 months after the wedding, Fiona and Gabe were sitting on the cedar bench on their apartment balcony sharing a single mug of hot cider. And across the city, the lights of the municipal library they'd built together were glowing warm against the twilight. Fiona had spent 6 months in therapy working through the trauma of the microburst before she felt ready to climb back into a crane cab. And she was currently operating tower cranes again, but for a different company with better safety protocols and more support. And Gabe had been promoted to formwork lead supervisor, which meant he spent less time on the active deck and more time coordinating from the ground. They hadn't needed a grand public rescue or a millionaire's bailout to build a life together. Real love wasn't a fairy tale promise. It was forged over grease-stained blueprints and two-way radio static and the quiet, calloused trust it took to lift the heavy things together. Inside their apartment, the 3-foot cedar crane model sat on the windowsill where the evening light hit it. And every time Fiona looked at it, she remembered that she would never have to hold the sky up alone again, because Gabe had built her something permanent that proved partnership was about carrying the weight together. And that was worth more than any amount of money or any perfect romantic gesture could ever be.